Dr. Swanson's research focuses on cognitive development and memory in children with learning disabilities. He explained that through the experimental literature, researchers have made some progress on identifying key cognitive variables or characteristics of learners that may play a role in the outcomes that they achieve. Two different approaches to improving academic outcomes include directly teaching cognitive processes, such as working memory, for extended periods of time, or embedding this training in academic tasks. Because there's not enough data to show that learners show generalized improvements from being explicitly taught cognitive processes, Dr. Swanson recommends embedding this training in academic domains. He isn't convinced, for example, that teaching memory will immediately help a student become more fluent at word retrieval. Dr. Swanson explained that the effect sizes of studies on cognitive interventions would lead one to believe that many things work. However, there is no standardized version of a control group. Frequently, researchers are comparing business as usual, which typically isn't working, to interventions with many components. Not only does this lead to large effect sizes, it makes it impossible to identify the active ingredients of the intervention. Dr. Swanson recommends that future studies compare two effective practices with small modifications to the treatment group. By only changing small pieces of the intervention package, researchers can identify the mechanisms of action. Additionally, researchers can learn a lot from consulting related fields. He gives the example of fMRI research in neuropsychology. Educational researchers know how to manipulate variables in the classroom, and neuropsychologists are able to identify whether or not changes are occurring in the brain. Collaborations or meta-analyses across fields might help identify the reasons behind why things change or how they work. Finally, Dr. Swanson emphasized the importance of reading and conducting meta-analyses. He recommends that students read meta-analyses first to understand the data across the literature and not overgeneralize the results of a particular study. After having a firm understanding of the literature base, he would recommend looking at individual studies.
Dr. Swanson mentioned that there remains a gap between cognitive processes and academic initiations such as RTI. From my perspective as a former practitioner, there seems to be a knowledge gap for teachers when it comes to implementing interventions to develop cognitive processes. Therefore, I wonder where should the field go to close this gap and support teachers to improve student outcomes. During the video, Dr. Swanson discussed research pertinent to working memory as a cognitive training strategy. In his study, he saw some interaction between working memory and problem solving. This conversation made me wonder about additional cognitive constructs that have been or can be studied as a way to improve outcomes for students. I specifically wonder about processes that are practitioner friendly. In the most recent synthesis of research from CLD's 35th conference, Beverly Weiser reported on Mason's 2013 meta-analysis, where findings showed using a critical thinking strategy such as TWA, think before, think while, think after reading, along with a strategy such as SRSD, self-regulated strategy development, increased student outcomes. He mentions this is important as researchers and practitioners continue to develop curriculum that works for all learners. I am interested in other critical thinking processes that can be used in conjunction with instructional strategies.
I thought it was interesting that Dr. Swanson recommended collecting more data before generalizing learning principles to entire classrooms of typically developing learners. He explained that we don't have the data to support applying cognitive interventions alone to whole classrooms. I think this fits both with the nomothetic and idiographic approach and highlights the fact that it is not necessarily a dichotomy, but a spectrum that researchers can navigate when trying to answer different research questions. I agree with the idea of collecting data on a small scale before generalizing the results to different populations.
Throughout this interview, module, and my experience as a student thus far, I have heard a reoccurring challenge with Tier 1 instruction. Researchers need to start with finding general principles and practices that work for most students before moving on to idiographic approaches. This is especially true for students with learning disabilities who are receiving instruction in general education settings. Teachers and students are each unique and different in teaching and learning styles. Therefore, it is impossible to generalize for every situation. There is a need to continue idiographic approaches once evidence-based general principles have been established.
Example, here are two patients who have been diagnosed with major depression that had virtually the same symptoms, yet radically different brains. One had really low activity in the brain, the other one had really high activity. How would you ever know what to do for them unless you actually looked? Treatment needs to be tailored to individual brains, not clusters of symptoms. After 22 years and 83,000 scans, the single most important lesson my colleagues and I have learned is that you can literally change people's brains. And when you do, you change their life. You are not stuck with the brain you have. You can make it better, and we can prove it. My colleagues and I performed the first and largest study on active and retired NFL players, showing high levels of damage in these players at a time when the NFL said they didn't know that playing football caused long-term brain damage. The fact was they didn't want to know. That was not a surprise. I think if you get most thoughtful 9-year-olds together and you talk. But what really got us excited was the second part of the study, where we put players on a brain smart program and demonstrated that 80% of them could improve in the areas of blood flow, memory, and mood, that you are not stuck with the brain you have. You can make it better on a brain smart program. How exciting is that? I am so excited. Reversing brain damage is a very exciting new frontier, but the implications are really much wider. Here is the scan of a teenage girl who has ADHD, who was cutting herself, failing in school, and fighting with her parents. When we improved her brain, she went from D's and F's to A's and B's and was much more emotionally stable. Here's a scan of Nancy. Nancy had been diagnosed with, or to illustrate this point, is Andrew, a 9-year-old boy who attacked a little girl on the baseball field for no particular reason, and at the time was drawing pictures of himself hanging from a tree and shooting other children. Andrew was Columbine, Aurora, and Sandy Hook waiting to happen. Most psychiatrists would have medicated Andrew as they did Eric Harris and the other mass shooters before they committed their awful crimes. But SPECT imaging taught me that I had to look at his brain and not throw darts in the dark at him to understand what he needed. The SPECT scan showed a cyst the size of a golf ball occupying the space of his left temporal lobe. No amount of medication or therapy would have helped Andrew. When the cyst was removed, his behavior completely went back to normal, and he became the sweet, loving boy he always wanted to be. Now 18